But that's amazing. So you have 8 days, you said, left until
Uh,
the Toronto Sun is done.
yes,
And how many years has it been?
31.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know, or do you have an idea about what your parting message, your parting op-ed might be about?
Yes, I've actually written most of it. It's going to appear on Sunday, and it's even though I'm not officially done till Friday, next Friday, and it's just going to talk about my last 31 years and what motivated me, what moved me, and a little bit about the changing climate, but mostly about how the good things, the
Mhm.
passion I had for the job, the fact that it was like as the I guess the world of journalism changed, so did my life change. And it was all chronicled in the Sun throughout. I came out while I was a
Mhm.
journalist at the Sun. I met my wife on a story. We married 3 years later, and um, I wrote about that in the Sun, and I wrote about coming out, as I said.
Mhm.
Um, I ran for office as for MPP. That was recorded in the Sun. My first book
Mhm.
was chronicled in the Sun. And then, of course, my sweet dad, when he died last November, that was also on the front page of the Sun.
So there's been a lot of milestones in the last 30 years.
You're not, the years have flown by, but I have enjoyed every minute. Well, I shouldn't say every minute. There are things I have not enjoyed about the job. It's really the changing nature of the job, but I went into it with a passion to help people, and I truly feel I have helped a lot of people, and they have actually been memorable to me. I mean, they've written me emails, and there are many people that I will remember who told me their stories, who I tried to help, and I walk away with my head held high, very high.
Do you feel like it's a little bit of a bittersweet moment? Because I feel that some of the reason why you're making this decision seems to be the changing climate or the culture around journalism. So it feels like there's been so many accolades that you've had over these decades. And also there seems to be this sort of nagging feeling in the back that there's something else that's also bothering you about it.
Well, what's bothering me is that journalism has changed and not for the better. And that, you know, let's just say that I was trained in the print media, and the print media is dying. Not so slowly, a very quick death. It's all digital, it's all social media now. And I was trained as a writer, and I think I'm a very good writer, and to put my thoughts to the printed word on the page. And I've had to adapt tremendously, and I have throughout the years. And I've been able to use social media
Mhm.
to promote stories. I've done digital videos. I've done a lot of broadcast media. But the, I guess the use of print, of the printed paper, I still love the feel of a newspaper in my hands, as do many of my generation.
Mhm.
But sadly, your generation, the younger millennials and down, and
Mhm.
I'm not blaming you, but everything is online now. Everything is digital. And that's a blessing and a curse. And it's very much a curse because things can spread so quickly online. A tweet, a Facebook post, and often it's not good stuff. It's hate
Mhm.
and the online bullying that I've experienced just in the last 3 years. For having the audacity to actually speak with common sense to address issues that many others don't, has increased multifold, and it's a really sad statement in our society.
Mhm. And I think that's amazing, just even the statement from you, because for you and your journalistic career, I associate you with being someone who has such a thick skin, someone who's willing to go into some of these
Yeah,
arenas where I would never go to and
yeah,
really put people on the spot and ask them tough questions. And for
yeah,
someone like you who's even feeling this, like I can only imagine the average person, especially the millennials who are probably not as resilient as some of the
yeah.
older journalists, I don't know how it's a sustainable intellectual ecosystem.
Well, what's sustainable is that you're either a woke journalist or you're not. So you either go with the flow and cover a certain way and be, I guess, left of center, and report the news that way, and perpetuate what I think has become a shocking and alarming bias in the media,
Mhm.
or you don't. And yes, I have very thick skin. I've gone where few have dared to, and into too many encampments to count, into protests. I've been accused of having brass balls. I don't know. But I've gone to cover stories that few will do.
Right.
And I've never been afraid. But the the thing that has changed is the working up of people, working up of the, um, I guess, the woke or the progressives or whatever you want to call them, online, to the point where they appear in person, they recognize you, and they're in your face. And
Right.
that's what's changed,
Mhm.
is that people are not afraid to confront you in your face.
Mhm.
There was a time many years ago, maybe 10 years ago, where I used to live in Yorkville, and I'd walk down the street and the odd person would recognize me because my logo was in the paper or I did something, and they say, "Oh, you're Sue-Ann Levy." And I'd be really surprised. I'd,
Right.
I'd be really surprised at somebody because I'm a print journalist, I'm not on TV. Now they share if they don't like you, they share you, and they have, like, I have had in the last 3 years, I have had posters put up about me,
Mhm. Yeah.
100 posters put in Cabbagetown,
Mhm.
big picture of myself, mean looking picture with the word bigot underneath,
Mhm.
posted on polls by the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. I've had pictures of me posted online saying she did this or she did that or she's an Islamophobe.
Mhm.
And and then people see that, they get agitated, they're ignorant, and they're uninformed. Let's just say not ignorant, but uninformed, and they get riled up. They want it. They think they're being socially conscious,
Mhm.
and they have no problem coming at you. And I've had this happen where they've come into my face. I've been followed at protests. Things have been screamed at me, and I've been called names, but mostly that in your face. You know,
And
like where
where
you don't feel you're safe.
because you have wisdom and a vantage point, which maybe younger listeners don't have, but where or when did this trend begin? Like, was this present in a very minimal form when you first began journalism, or is this something which sort of escalated throughout the decade?
No, no, it hasn't. I mean, I was thinking about what I was going to say to you before this podcast. And when I started journalism many moons ago, 31 years ago, if people didn't agree with your viewpoint or they agreed with your viewpoint, they would call you up.
Right.
I don't want to date myself, but this is before social media. So they would call you up or they'd write you handwritten letters. And I used to get these little handwritten letters
Yeah.
and I'd respond to some of them, and some of them, like, I'd take the time to respond. You
Right.
didn't have this online email. And so somewhere along the line, the online stuff happened. Okay. So then people would email you their and I saw a real evolution of things. So then they would email you, and they didn't always agree with you, but some of them were polite, some of them were less polite. They'd call you names or whatever. But I'd respond, and that would be it. Okay, and then social media came about, and I think I remember getting onto social media about the year. Well, when I ran for office in 2009, that's when it became really, really, big. And it was something new. And they told me I had to, as a candidate, tweet and go on Facebook. And I don't think Instagram even existed then. But they told me I had to do all of these things. And I'm thinking, why? And then I went on Twitter. They put an account together for me, which is the same account I have to this day. And I said, oh, this is fun. And I started doing it. And so you do it to provide information or to make comments.
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden the world exploded, and people are watching you and monitoring you. And I got caught. I think my first indication that this was not as fun as I thought it would be, is when I made the mistake of tweeting from Florida back in 2012. I was very upset with Obama's foreign relations policies and his viewpoint of Israel. And I felt that he was anti-Israel. And he was in a debate, I think with Mitt Romney at the time, and he was discussing his stance on Israel. And I said something about him being Pinocchio, his nose was growing, and then I hashtag Muslim BS, which meant that he was linked to the Muslim culture.
Right.
And I got accused, oh my God, internet exploded. I got accused of being, Twitter exploded. I got attacked. I got accused of being Islamophobe, racist. I got accused of being a birther, that, you know, I was one of those people who ascribed to the fact that he was not born in the States, which wasn't true. Like, people made all these assumptions. And the Grid, actually, I'm looking at it right up here, did a story about me. They called it, Is Sue-Ann Levy the Devil? And they talked about this infamous tweet.
Right.
And suddenly I realized that that was when it was my first indication that Twitter, social media could be used, particularly Twitter, which I think is the realm of the woke progressive, could be used to really go after you, really, really attack you.
Right.
So, yeah, so that was 2012 already, way back. And then things, you know, went on. I wrote my book, and then I would get in the odd trouble with my tweets and things like that. But it was really after my book came out in 2000, it came out in 2016 and 17, 18, where I started to see the real change, you know, the emphasis on feelings and the indoctrination of kids in universities. And I started writing about that. And my first real clue that things were escalating to the worse, and that people, like, I'd been threatened with lawsuits many times over the years, but at first I had to fend off a lawsuit from a woman, pro-Palestinian person, a rabid anti-Semite, and it got all the way almost to court, and then they backed out. But I had to defend myself because I had called her on social media anti-Semitic. She had attacked me at and that was, I think it was 2017. She attacked me at a rally with a Palestinian flag and hit me and started calling me all kinds of names, you dirty Zionist and things like that. And of course, what they do is they use lawfare to go after you. So I had to defend that lawsuit. It was a sequence of events. I went to an Indigenous town hall. It was to put in an Indigenous shelter, healing center for
this on YouTube.
Prisoners. And I had the audacity of asking a hard question. And next thing I know, the organizer complains to the police who are there that I'm harassing her. So this is all about hurt feelings, blah, blah, blah. They were using that. I got led out of that meeting by 4 armed cops and told I couldn't come back in. No reason other than I was doing my job. So that was, you know, it escalated. And then 2018 is when I really started to see.
Like a wake-up call.
Yeah, people coming at me full force.
And it's a generational thing. Like, do you feel your cohort is more mentally resilient and they're more willing to face criticism, and there's something amongst millennials? Or is this a political divide between maybe conservative and liberal? Like, what's your sense?
Very good question. I think it's both. I think that, you know, over the years, I covered, you know, the indoctrination of students and the dismissing of viewpoints in the last couple of years in the university realm. And I think that kids are being indoctrinated in universities. They're being taught to basically hate Israel in some ways, right across Canada, and to support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel. And I think it's partly that, and I think our media has turned very left leaning in some ways to survive. And I also think that a lot of us folks have sort of lived life, paid taxes, dealt with political leaders or leaders, political people who are pretending to be leaders. And so we're a little sort of grounded in the ways of the world. So it's a
Right.
combination of age
Hmm.
and um, and the political bent. Now, I happen to think too that there's a really disturbing vibe that I get about, like, with respect to ageism as well.
Yeah.
So there's that going on. There's many
Could you speak more
conflicting
about that?
factors.
That's actually interesting. I haven't heard that as often. I'd like to hear more.
Well, I think I found in recent years that and I've never hid my age, and you can go on Wikipedia and find out that I'm going to be 65 in September, although I don't feel it. I run marathons. Um, and all you have to do is count how many years I've been working.
Right.
But I found in recent years that people who want to attack me, it was either on the comment boards, because we have comment boards, uh, on Twitter or whatever, they'll come after me and say, "You old hag, it's time to call it quits, time to retire," that kind of thing. Well, now, in some sense, I probably deserve a bit of it because I've said that to politicians that they're past their due date. So I don't take that too seriously.
Yeah. That's so funny. And it seems to be also, I think what you're touching on seems to, I don't know if it's transported from journalism over to publishing, but publishing is also dealing with this very much. There was a lot of controversy around Jordan Peterson's latest book around these
Mhm.
sort of internal rifts amongst publishing houses over allowing people to release books. Do you have any plans to write a book in the future? And are you sort of afraid that you're going to be walking across one of these tripwires potentially down the road?
I think if I were to write a book, and I am seriously thinking about doing, I would self-publish this time. I learned a lot from having my book published. Problem with a publishing house is that Random House is a wonderful publisher, and you get your book on the shelf in. I got it on the shelf in. Oh my God,
You go?
uh, Indigo, yes, Indigo, and but a lot of the copies sold on Amazon. I can do that.
Right.
They didn't get me into other places, and they were terrible at promoting the book.
Mhm.
And they sort of, Canadian writers are sort of a throwaway because they get a grant.
Mhm.
And I did most of the promotion myself. I worked it. I went to um, political gatherings and sold the book. I went, anybody who would ask me, I went to readings, this sort of thing. I spent a year promoting it. I actually wore myself out doing it. So I think I would self-publish, so I won't have to deal with any of these things, these hurdles,
Could you
a-
tease an, an
and
idea?
get a good defamation lawyer. By the way, I have one on standby, waiting.
Could you tease do you have an idea in your mind about what you're considering writing in the future? Can you tease a little bit of details about that?
Yeah, it's going to be an explosive book about elder abuse.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
And there's
with
a lot
real life examples.
of that's really interesting. And I'm curious then, if we're moving back to the journalism sphere, what would you what advice would you give to a 20 something who's interested in getting into the journalism space? Would you tell them just to sort of pack up and run away, or is there?
Right away. No, I mean, I think it's. I'm not the least bit cynical about what I've. Like I said, I'm very proud of what I've done, and I didn't realize I had such a wonderful voice, such a, I guess, if I didn't get the attention, negative or positive, it would mean that I wasn't having an impact. I am having an impact. I know that. And when I announced that I was leaving a week ago, I got very, very positive feedback and some very negative feedback. So, at least they're reading me. I'm not boring. Um,
Exactly.
I think if you are politically aligned with the right of the spectrum, I think you're going to have a rude awakening walking into any newsroom these days. I have heard from people, for instance, during the recent conflict, um, Israeli Palestinian conflict, that their news channel did not want to report it, would not report the conflict with any sort of sympathy or understanding of the Israeli situation. And that's a really sad statement in the media. I've always had the freedom to write about anti-Semitism, but I'm one of the few in Toronto who has.
Right.
So, I mean, I would go in with my eyes wide open if I am of a particular bent that happens to be. And these days, you know what? I have to tell you, anybody right of the rabid left is considered far right. It's just crazy the way they position you.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that what also saddens me about the change in journalism is and I write this in my final piece, that I was trained in the classic style in journalism school to get all sides of the story, to go to a scene, to interview people, to write about what people feel and emote and things like that. And I still practice that way. I still go to the encampments. I still go and talk if somebody's afraid of a homeless shelter down on the Esplanade. I go and talk to the people.
Right.
And you'd be surprised how few people do that these days. Or talk to the people impacted. It's the activists are driving the agenda. And it saddens me to see, number one, the amount of lazy journalism out there, the amount of pre-scripted narrative out there, and the number of, say, opinion writers, because I've spent the last 20 years being an opinion writer, who don't get all sides of the story. You may hate what I write,
right,
but I always try to get a comment from whomever I'm criticizing, whether it's a mayor, whether it's the chief executive officer of some corporation. They can choose not to respond, but I always make the effort, not just once, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times.
Right. Are there any publications? Has the Toronto Sun been insulated from some of these forces? Or are there any Canadian publications that have done a good job in trying to hold on to that classic journalist legacy? Or is it sort of being eroded right now consistently?
It's being eroded. I think, with the combination of the lack of resources, the lack of money going into journalism, that too, the lack of staff, all these things are making a difference.
And when you walk into a newsroom, are there people around you who are sort of like-minded? Are they afraid to speak their minds? Like, what is the feeling like when you pre-COVID, when there was a newsroom that you could walk into? Did you feel like you had to sort of speak in whispers about certain subjects, or you had to be?
No, not at the Toronto Sun. No. But I was always the most controversial. I was always looked at as the go-to person, and in fact, they put me on the union, even though I wrote like unabashedly anti-union things over the years, because I think they work at cross purposes with the economy. They asked me to be on the union because I was outspoken at the Sun. I mean, the editorial union.
And
so no, not at the Sun.
From the beginning of your career, were you always wanting to push the envelope journalistically, or was that something which sort of evolved, like your writing style and you're sort of posing the tough questions, really chasing down stories? I feel, especially when it comes to city hall corruption, political influence, it always seems to be your wheelhouse. Was that something which, from the first days when you became a journalist, that you always were interested in, or is that something that developed?
I think it kind of developed. See, this is not my first career. It was my second career. I actually worked for 12 years in public relations and was bored out of my mind. I had been trained in journalism and, just found myself in PR.
Right.
So I made the jump. It was scary. I went from making a fairly good salary to making nothing and starting my career all over again. But it panned out. But for a couple of years, no, I just did what I was asked to do. And I loved every minute. I was a general assignment reporter. But then I got into covering education, which was I really, really, really wanted to cover education and get into looking at the school boards. And that's when I found my niche. I started writing about what these school board bureaucrats were doing. And I think one of my first pieces really exploded, and they hated me. They absolutely hated me. And I would get this glimmer in my eye because I loved it, where I did the expense accounts of all the school board educators, the directors of education, and this is pre-amalgamation days. So there were 6 of them. And there was one who ran the Toronto School Board, and she liked to go to lunch at the Prince Arthur Room. So we actually ambushed her at the Prince Arthur Room. She was going into lunch. I found out what the menu was. I mean, I love doing that stuff. I think I was a detective in a former life. So that kind of took off, and people were screaming and yelling at the school boards. I mean, the people underneath loved it.
Yeah.
And I had a school board bureaucrat, education director. He was with the Scarborough board, run out the back door after a meeting to avoid me.
Yeah.
I got used to that. A lot of politicians would run away.
Yeah.
They'd run out the back door. And then our executive editor at the time called me into his office. I thought, oh God, what did I do now? And he said, you've done such a magnificent, I started writing a column in education. He said, you've done such a magnificent job. I'd like you to go to City Hall. This was just as amalgamation was happening, and do the same thing at City Hall. And there I landed 20 years later.
Was there any story when you look back on your career, or maybe a handful of stories, which you're really blessed and you feel so grateful that you had the chance to write and raise awareness about these issues and speak about them, like that you really look back on fondly?
I think my best years were certainly at City Hall during the David Miller years. And I was in many ways the official opposition, because he did so many crazy things and he really blew the budget. And that was sort of my first blush into how out of control city government was.
Right.
And I'd get all kinds of brown envelopes, and literally they were brown envelopes back then. So this is only in like 2004, 2005, 2006.
Yeah.
And David Miller absolutely loathed that I gave him a hard time. So David Miller he was very tall, and when we'd be in a scrum, and I was considerably shorter than him, he would always, when he was answering my question, like rear himself up like an angry bull and say, well, Sue-Ann. I was lectured a lot by politicians. And so those were great years. And that's when I met my wife and that sort of thing. So those are really heady years. I think the work I did at Toronto Community Housing to expose the rot there and the corruption, it was frustrating, but I'm very, very proud of that. I'm proud of the investigative work I did on Regent Park. I won an award for that in 2012. And that investigative award, and that was revealing that this giant revitalization was just draining cash, and that the developers were making all the money, and the poor were being shuffled out of the only home they knew, right, and being sent to buildings way beyond Regent Park.
Are there I'm trying to remember. I just sort of lost my train of thought for a second, but
I was just going to say that when I got into doing, my favorite work was investigative work. And when I got into that, I mean, you can ask Denise, my wife, that I would spend the evenings just going through the internet, trying to find how to connect the dots. And and counting and looking, and, this developer paid this and that. Right. Oh my God. It was like detective work.
And the other thing I wanted to ask you about, because it is the end of Pride Month and I'd like to release this for the end of Pride Month, what has it been your journey as coming out as a journalist, coming out personally as well? You've written a lot about this in your book, which we'll put in the hyperlinks below. But what's the significance of Pride Month? What's its continued significance to you? And maybe speak a little bit about your relationship with it. I know you visited a couple of times to the Toronto and reported from it. So I think you have a lot of interesting perspective from it.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because Denise and I kind of landed right in the midst of the Pride Parade back in 2008, nine, just after we were married. And that was because this fringe group called Queers Against Israeli Apartheid had basically hijacked the parade. And they lasted 5 years. They were a virulent anti-Israel group, and we worked for 5 years to get them out. So I marched with a group called Kulano, which was pro-Israel, to wave the flag, and as did Denise. But that was my first exposure to Pride. But my journey as a lesbian, openly gay, married woman only really started in about 2005, 6, or the year before I met Denise, when I decided I'd had enough and I wanted to come out. Prior to that, I was living a closeted relationship, and a lot of it to do with the atmosphere at the newspaper and in journalism, where I didn't feel comfortable being openly gay in a newsroom. That really, in the early days, in my experience, was pretty chauvinistic. And it has evolved tremendously since then. But back in the 90s, I worked on the city desk for a couple of years with some pretty chauvinistic people. And I just thought that it would be very career limiting if I were to come out. So I lived with one foot in the heterosexual world, one in the gay world. And I have to say, it was so liberating when I finally did come out. And I was, at that point, the landscape had changed tremendously, and I was embraced. I was encouraged to write about it. And the reason I was encouraged to write about it really by my wife was because I saw a column in our paper by a young man, Dave Menzies, who's with Rebel Media. We're good friends now, but he really upset me because he said it was good to be gay. And I looked at it and I actually started to cry. And I said, no, it hasn't been a good journey. Yeah. So that really set it off. And then I got involved with the Pride Parade. And then imagine you spent 20 years coming out of the closet. You were in the closet for 20 years. You finally have the courage to come out. And then the people who run Pride accuse you of not really being gay and not deserving a seat at the table, that you don't deserve to be a part of the gay community. And why was that? Because after we had gotten Queers Against Israeli Apartheid out of the parade, Black Lives Matter took over where they left off. And I wrote some very scathing columns about them hijacking the parade, and that Pride is not an organization just for political purposes that way. It's to celebrate, the fight to come out and to get married. And when they banned the police from marching in the parade, I got very, very upset with that. And that's when Pride basically told me I didn't belong, that I was embarrassed. They were embarrassed that I was a member of the gay community. So what's happened with the Pride organization is become, again, like most other places, very woke, very progressive, and it doesn't represent people like me. Right. They don't have a cause to fight anymore, Ari. They do not have a cause. We've gotten everything we've asked for. So what are they doing? They're jumping on any bandwagon they can find. And they've moved so far away from their mandate and their mission that they've basically turned off a large portion of the gay population who are just living their lives and working hard and, live good lives and happy to be out.
Right. And what's the impression that you get, maybe if you know more community members, especially people who don't fit in maybe the Pride Parade box that's acceptable? Is your sentiment widely shared amongst them about sort of feeling excluded, or that it's sort of run amok about the political agenda of the march itself?
Yeah. And many of them I interviewed when the police ban first came into effect. And they shot themselves in the foot. I mean, you should pardon the expression, but they shot themselves in the foot because they lost a huge number of donations. They lost a huge number of spectators at the parade, and I chronicled that in the paper over a course of 2 years. And so then they suddenly and desperately had to work their way back
Hmm.
But I just checked in with them because you ignore them because I've ignored them because of COVID. They haven't been out marching in the parade, but I saw that the board is all full of progressives. And then I thought, oh, brother, and I was the one to reveal a couple of years ago their huge deficit. I mean, they ran 1.4 million dollar deficit, which was huge for that organization
Yeah.
that relied on grants.
Do you ever speak to them or some of the leaders? And it's funny because the equality argument should be so inherent in the struggle, and yet there's a lack of equality in intellectual representation or political representation amongst, like you're saying, the board or perhaps even the political
Mhm.
initiatives of the movements. Like it seems to be very exclusionary towards gay conservatives, which I'm sure
They
there
are the most
are tons.
intolerant bunch of people I have ever met. They are worse
Hmm.
than some of the people who are a little bit concerned about gays. They are the most intolerant. And the last time I went to a Pride board meeting before COVID 2 years ago, sat myself down, and somebody sat beside me and recognized me and actually got up and moved.
Really?
Yeah,
Yeah. Has that ever
another gay
happened
person.
in your career from another gay person?
Never happened.
Right.
Never happened.
Right. That's amazing.
No.
It's amazing
Yeah.
to feel like you walk so many different fault lines, and it seems like I was going to ask you, has there been anything that you've done where you haven't faced a tremendous amount of opposition, or has there been anything that's been sort of a layup, or is it always seems to be a hill to climb and there's always something which doesn't work out smoothly?
Well, I proudly say that I've been banned by more counselors on Twitter than any other journalist. So yeah, that's a good one. I've been thrown out of meetings. I've been screamed at protests. But and I'm proud to say all of those things. That means I've been doing a good job. But the one thing that I had tremendous pleasure in doing in the last year was covering the long-term care home crisis and talking to people about their stories and dealing with their loved ones. And one of my editors said, very nicely tweeted or wrote something a couple months ago, that it's amazing how I was able to cover all this without once being threatened with a lawsuit by any of the long-term care homes. And that's because I practice good journalism. I always went to them for a comment. We have a really good lawyer, and I dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. And, so I had gave me a tremendously good feeling to cover these stories. And I had a wonderful compliment from an ex-colleague who was working at Canadian Press, was at the Sun, and then left to go to the Canadian Press about a week ago, just before I announced my retirement. He said, "You moved that agenda." And before I got kicked off Talk 640 for being too conservative, and before the announcers stopped using me, and that was another change in the media on News Talk 1010, they used to say that I got action.
Yeah.
And then suddenly the landscape changed, and I got kicked off Talk 640 in 2018, along with other conservative commentators, and the woke stations won't use me anymore, my comments, except CBC, Metro Morning. The only time they used me to come on is when I talked about my dad having COVID
Hmm.
in his dementia facility.
Right.
And I went on twice, went on the day of my funeral, and that's the only time they have called me.
Wow.
So that was a safe subject, Ari.
Right. Have you ever thought about starting your own podcast and entering
Yes.
a sort of an
Yes.
unrestricted platform?
Yes.
You would do amazing. I think someone
Absolutely. It's working. It's percolating right now. Somebody very near and dear to you said the other day, and she put it really well. She said, at this point, they want you to stir, not simmer. They want you to simmer, not stir the pot. They just want it to simmer.
Right.
And that's the way the landscape has changed. It's a best analogy. They do not want me to stir the pot anymore.
Right. And that's exactly not your writing philosophy. Like, you are a bulldog. You go after it.
Yeah. And I can't live in, I can't operate in that journalistic universe.
Right.
The mainstream media, you just have to look south of the border.
Hmm.
to see what's happened with CNN and even Fox News getting mushy, and you know, and I have to be true to myself.
Right. And I think that's the most important thing at the end of the day, that you have to feel authentic and genuine in your writing.
Yeah,
Will you continue to write occasionally moving forward?
absolutely. I'm not going away.
Which outlets would you be looking to? I know you write for the J a little bit, which is a Canadian Jewish
Yeah,
magazine. Are there any
but
others
see,
that you sort of have your eye on?
the CJN has asked me to
Okay.
write too. If
Mhm.
I'm not too, I have to be a little bit, yeah, walk a very fine line. And there are a couple other things that will come out. I'm looking at writing for, but they'll all be, let's just say, platforms that share my view of the world.
Right. That's amazing.
And I'm going to start up my blog again.
Oh yes, you definitely
Yeah,
should.
yeah.
That's amazing. So in the coming week or so, are there any very important things you're going to be doing at the Sun? Are you sort of packing up your office, or is that done already? Are there any
No, it's not
final?
done. I'll
Yeah.
do that the last day, very last day. We haven't been in the newsroom for over a year. So I have to go into this, talk about ghosts.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of putting it off. The everything else is settled.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm trying to, over the next couple of days, touch on every issue that, like, try to get to many of the issues I've covered,
Yeah.
and sort of like, okay, this is my parting shot. So today I did something on the activists
Mhm.
and the homeless camps and, the encampments.
Mhm.
And I'm working on a piece for tomorrow on COVID and taking away our freedom and lack of control and, control over us and
Yeah.
us not having control. And yeah. And then I think I'm going to do something on anti Semitism tomorrow, reveal this guy at the school board, and he's still operating.
It's amazing.
So
No, it's amazing. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I'd love to have you back on again. But it's amazing just trying to cover so much ground and so much history and accolades in a very
you
short
made me think. You've made me think of so much that I've done. You tend to forget. You just move on,
time.
and I never. It never bothered me to work long hours or to. It was a passion of mine. It really was. Like,
Mm.
I always joke that if I wanted to make a lot of money, I wouldn't have been in this profession. But I look back at these 30 years and I feel like I've done so much,
Mhm. Well,
so
it's
much.
interesting. Like I think I worked at TD Bank for 2 years in a corporate job, which I did not like, and I've progressively have moved towards where you're going, and hopefully we'll be able to find something more full time. But I think you're probably one of the extremely lucky people who was able to pursue their dream and live their life on their own
Hmm.
terms and be able to enjoy it, which is tremendous. Like so few people do that.
And I've always said along the way that the Sun, always had my back, and and I'd be like the troublemaker. I would get into little scraps here and there, and they always had my back, like when the Muslim BS comment and this sort of thing. And I
Yeah.
made another mistake a couple of years ago, but it's hard. It's hard now because the landscape has changed so much, and everybody's struggling to make a buck, especially with COVID. And yeah, so
If I have one last question to part on, is there one piece of advice you would have given yourself at the beginning of your journalism journey? And does that advice still hold true for 20 somethings like myself today, or is it dramatically different?
yes, absolutely. number one, number one, stay off social media at night. Okay,
Yes.
stay off social media at night when you're tired.
Mm.
And, and when you want to post something and you want to react to something, count to 10, go to bed, wake up in the morning, think about it.
Yeah.
Don't be impulsive.
That's amazing.
That has gotten me into more trouble.
Yes, that's 100% true. It's tough for a lot of people
Yeah.
to be like that. I try my best, and thankfully I have a girlfriend who can hopefully moderate and filter
Yeah.
out any poor decision making that I have.
And that's the advice I'm going to give myself going forward as I return to Twitter in full force. So I'm going to say, okay, there's a cutoff. After 7 o'clock at night, no tweets.
That's amazing. That is perfect advice, especially for people of our generation who
Yeah.
are addicted to their devices and think
Yeah.
experience
Yeah.
everything through Twitter.
And that has been a huge, huge problem, Ari, is that, you can get so wrapped up in it that you forget about the world around you. Although I pride myself in,
Mhm.
getting out there but, you know,
Yeah.
that, like I said, that has gotten me into more trouble.
Is your partner a good anchor? Does she give you a good
Yeah.
grasp of reality away from sort of the journalism sort of microscope?
Yes, very much so.
Most important thing, probably.
Yeah. And I'm looking forward to spending more time actually focusing on her rather than the computer.
Amazing. Thank you, Sue-Ann, for everything. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Thank
Okay. You're welcome.
you so much.
Nice talking to you.
Yeah, this has been amazing. And I will keep you in touch and everything. And hopefully you get this podcast started. I'd love to see what happens with this because I think it will go
Yeah.
viral.
Yeah. We're working on it. Stay
Amazing.
tuned.
Yes. Thank you so much, Sue-Ann. Have a good day and all the
You
best.
too. Okay.
Bye. Take it easy.
Bye.